Alrighty. What's up, everybody? We are back with our weekly deep dive podcasts. We kind of very unannounced took a break for it's been like almost a month, hasn't it?
Seems like
now?
a month, yeah.
We honestly just we got busy with things going on at the church. I think Noah and I were both feeling like we needed a break. We were going on several months of pretty consistently doing the deep dives with only a few breaks in between, and so we ended up missing out on 1 week. 1 week turned into 2, 3, and we sort of unofficially took a hiatus from our deep dive podcasts. But there's been a lot of good things happening at the church. I will kind of go into some of those a little bit more at the end of this podcast episode, but suffice to say, we're back at it.
Yeah.
We're back again. A little bit later, we had some more technical difficulties because, of course, we're starting up again. We should have all kinds of issues if we're gonna try to get it going up and going again. So,
and we're breaking in the new space. This is the first time the deep dive is being done in our new space where we've moved. So
absolutely,
it's kind of cool.
Yeah. So the furniture's all the same. You probably still recognize all the furniture, but it's in a new spot. So again, I will explain a little bit more about that at the end of the episode today. But we've got a really cool topic today, and I didn't want to drag it on. We're just going to try to dive right into the topic. If this is your first time tuning in, though, welcome to the Wayfarers Deep Dive podcast. My name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here at Wayfarers. I'm here with our teaching pastor, Noah Randolph, and we have a special guest over the magic of internet web conferencing applications over Zoom web conferencing. We've got Tom Stolaric joining us again. If you want to say hi to everybody, Tom.
Thanks for having me back, guys.
Absolutely. So for those of you that did tune in on the last few episodes, you saw Tom. He was with us in person at our old studio space, but we've got him over Zoom today. We thought it'd be fun to bring him back on to talk about this topic. And so since we haven't been doing a sermon series like we've been doing, usually that's what we do in these deep dive podcasts is we break down what we've been talking about in our sermons. We dive deeper in the topics of our sermons. But we wanted to talk today about a little bit more of a general topic that relates to the church specifically. So I'm going to turn it over to Noah. If you want to explain a little bit, set the scene for us. What are we talking about today? What's the topic?
So the big fancy word that we're talking about today is called ecclesiology, which is really just the study of the church. But a lot of I'll start at the beginning of kind of my growth in church, and we'll just kind of branch out into the question overall. As a kid, I grew up in a church environment pretty much all my life. I'm one of those people that just was born into the church nursery, as you might call it. And so I've had really unique experiences of being always churched my entire life. And I've seen a lot of different churches. I was in a Presbyterian church for my younger years and then switched to a Baptist church for mainly most of my teen years. In college, I was in a Methodist church. So I've just kind of been in a lot of different denominations, and I've seen different ways that things have been done in churches. But one of the things that really for me as a young kid was in the churches I was growing up in at that time, I encountered an idea of church that was very different to what I am seeing now in church. And the way that church was done when I was growing up was very much of the philosophy that you existed to serve the church in whichever ways it was trying to work towards. You were there to help them in whatever way was best, and that was probably the ideal of what you could do as a church member, was to help them in whatever ways they needed. So if you were like going to a soup kitchen, if you were volunteering for events where you were helping feed the homeless, if you were volunteering to run sound for their services, you were considered the ultimate Christian almost in these church services. That was like the top of the line, like those were the best people. Those were the people that were always singled out as like, man, they're just so sacrificing so much of their time for God. And it was very volunteer driven in these churches growing up. When I got into college, sort of the reverse happened, where I interacted with a lot of churches that were completely the opposite, where church actually existed for you, and the worship was tuned to your preferences. The sermons were tuned to your specific ways that you were dealing with life and circumstances, and church almost was a way for you to put your feet up and relax, and to sort of enjoy a service or enjoy an experience in the auditorium. And they really didn't need you. Like, you weren't there to serve. They already had a hired staff, and they were paying all those people to do all of that work. And they really didn't need you to serve at all. They had already got all of that taken care of behind the scenes and meetings and things of that nature. And so really your only job was button, chair, sit, watch, and go home. And I began to realize that there was just this huge difference between what I grew up and what I'm seeing now in church life. And so I just started asking the question, what's the strengths of both? What's the strengths of what I grew up in? What's the strengths of what I'm seeing now? What are the weaknesses in what I grew up in, and what are the weaknesses in what I see now? And what do we see Scripture saying about this issue? Is it better to be more asking your members to be very servant-oriented and be very volunteer-centric, or is it better to have paid staff and your normal everyday goers just get to enjoy something that everybody else is putting on for them? And that's really the question we're tackling today. Big question, but I think it'll be fun to really dive into that and see what we come up with.
Yeah. And so it's a conversation, as with all the ones we've had on these podcasts, that Noah and I just have had a little bit in private as we've been, thinking through what we want to do at the church here at Wayfarers. What is the kind of attitude that we want to have? I guess if I had to summarize it, it's basically a question of, do the church members, the people who are like members at the church, do they exist to serve the mission and purposes of the church and to serve the church itself and maybe the leaders? Or does the church and the leaders exist to serve the needs of the church members?
Right.
And
serve or be served? That is the question.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we thought it would be cool to bring Tom on, because he is also a minister at his church over at Crockett Mills, and I'm sure that you have had to ask yourself this conversation a little bit in your own ministry, Tom. So I'd love for you to, maybe if you're feeling up to it, take a first crack at what you think about some of these issues, and kind of what have been your thoughts related to that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think this is a great topic to discuss, and I think it's definitely something that is relevant. And so, I think we need to have a good, healthy discussion about it. I think, the easy answer is a bit of both, right? So there should be a bit of both going on. As far as, the needs of the congregation being met, obviously there's going to be a good amount of that where there's different individuals coming in. Some of them have gone through different circumstances. They need to be shepherded. They need to be guided. And so that needs to be a part of it. But then there's also, I think a real scriptural call for everyone to participate, right?
Right.
The idea of just coming in and sitting down and receiving and then getting up and leaving, that's not really scriptural at all, And so, when you first kind of were telling me about this topic, the passage that immediately came to my mind was Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 through 13. And I'll read that for you real quick.
Please do.
It says, "And he gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we attain to the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ."
Mm.
And so the main kind of phrase there is, he gave all these different roles: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. These are all, different, um, you know, people that have been gifted in certain ways, have leadership
Hmm.
roles, but they're there for the equipping of the saints. So they're there not just to do everything, they're there to equip the saints to be able to serve, right?
Mm.
And so the call to share the gospel, right, is not isolated to, the clergy,
Right.
so to speak.
Mm.
Yeah. That is the exact. I'm glad you brought that verse up, because that is the exact one that I do think perfectly addresses um, the issue at hand today.
Mhm.
I think maybe to really kind of give the full context to exactly what we're talking about, it might be helpful to go through a little bit of church history, I was thinking. So I'll explain it kind of how I've always understood it. Maybe you guys can chime in if you think that there is any gaps that I'm missing a little bit here. But
Yeah.
I would say obviously too, this is an oversimplification, broad strokes run through
2,000
church
years of
history.
history,
Yeah, 2,000 years of history. No big deal. But definitely for us at Wayfarers, and I know similarly at Crockett Mills, a lot of our focus has been to really look at the very first Christians in the first century church, see how they did things, and try to really take good examples from them, and
Right.
try to emulate that in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And what we see in the Bible is examples of letters written to those first Christians in those first several centuries. As as the church grew, we know that eventually, with Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire, becoming a Christian and then Christianizing the Roman Empire, you kind of had the church change in some ways from what it was in those early days when they were like a small minority that was being persecuted, and instead kind of became the majority religion of the world. And I've read a couple of really interesting books with people who have different ideas on it, but one of the things that definitely came out of that is when the entire Roman Empire at that time became Christian, it was a lot easier to
Christian.
it was a lot easier to just bring in aspects of what they were doing already in their pagan worship and just bring it into the church. And again, that's not what we're talking about today. Different people have different opinions as to whether that was good or whether that was not. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But I will say one of the big things that you can definitely see that came from that was you had a much more defined clergy and laity. You had, even like special robes and vestments that people would wear that were like the leaders in the church. And, historically, it can be proven that a lot of those vestments come from a lot of the Roman pagan religion and other things like that. So you kind of started to get a sharp divide between the people who were maybe the priests or the deacons and people that were the leaders in the church, and just the everyday masses, the everyday church members, in a lot of ways.
So what you're saying, just to sum that up, is in the early first century there was a lot less hierarchy between leaders.
Debatable. I don't know. Some people would say one way or another, but I think that at least the strong distinction between clergy and laity you saw really come into play with that sort of Romanization of the Christian church, and that continued on for all the way up into medieval times. We get, we're skipping hundreds and hundreds of years, obviously, going through all kinds of stuff. You get into the Reformation. In the Reformation was kind of one of the first times you started to see some people think through those responsibilities and those jobs, and whose job was it to do what, and all kinds of various different issues. But even in most Protestant churches, you still have a pretty clear,
distinction
clergy
of who's leader
and laity and all this kind of
and
stuff.
who's just a regular member.
And the only reason I'm bringing this up is personally, I have seen that is a big area where you get a lot of the difficulties, I think, between how most people who would traditionally be in vocational ministry, meaning they make their living from the ministry work that
Right.
they're doing, and the everyday average person that you meet. Even in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even in outside of Protestant churches and getting further into, what they call more low churches, churches with less hierarchy, churches with less liturgy, even in your traditional Southern Baptist church and areas like that, you still had a pretty clear distinction for the pastor,
Yeah.
and the role that they played, and then the everyday congregation. And I've noticed that as a little bit of a generational divide, I guess I would say, in the way a lot of people look at this sometimes. I know I have been more likely to encounter the perspective that it is the pastor's job to evangelize and to do things like that and do all the serving, and the member's job is just to show up and tithe, give their money. I've been more likely to encounter that perspective a little bit amongst some people in older generations, I think I would say. So historically, I think that you did have that model as the common model in the United States, especially for decades, where the people in the church would pay their money, pay 10% of their money to the church. They would pay a pastor, and then that pastor's responsibility was to visit the sick, to lead, to preach on Sundays, to evangelize, to convert people, to all of the Christian work that needed to be done. Was turned over to the paid pastor. And traditionally, at least I've seen, whenever people start to question that, when you do get a church maybe more like the one you grew up in, Noah, where they start trying to encourage the members to do stuff. One of the first pushbacks I hear lots of times is, that's not my job. I pay my tithe. That's the pastor's job.
Let the professionals handle this.
Yeah, let the professionals handle this. And so that has been, I think, sort of subconsciously, I think the perspective that a lot of people have had for, a really, really long time is just you pay this guy to do everything and he does everything. And so this is my long, really roundabout way of saying what's been interesting in the verse that you brought up, Tom, is that, because I remember the very first time I read this verse and the very first time it really hit home for me, I was kind of shocked by the fact that, at least my understanding of this verse and the implications of it, is that it is, like you said, God gifted certain people with certain responsibilities, maybe the pastors, the evangelists, the teachers, and those people, the people we would traditionally consider as the clergy, the paid people, let them handle it. But what Paul says in Ephesians is that God gifted those people not so that they can go out and be the ones to do that Christian work, but so that they can equip the members of the church to do the work.
Right.
And so
That's exactly what
I
it
do
says.
think, so I do think that, biblically at least, the model we see is that you do have church leaders. You do have people, Paul says it's right for these people whose work is in the church to be paid by the church. But at least in this passage in Ephesians, it seems like the primary responsibility of those church leaders is to equip the church members to be the ones that do ministry. And so I think that is pretty clear and pretty hard to argue for anybody that would just be like, that's the pastor's job. I'm like, actually, I think the pastor's job is to equip you to go and to do the ministry work. Where I think the rub has come, and this is the thing I'd be curious to hear y'all's opinion about a little bit, has been in defining what are those works of service that the book of Ephesians, this verse in Ephesians is saying. It says equip. He's given us these pastors, evangelists, preachers, teachers, all those people to equip God's people for works of service, to build up in unity, all those things. What are those works of service specifically that those people are being called to? Because I think what I've started to have a lot more sympathy for the people that are just that's not my job, that's what I pay you to do,
Mm-hmm.
is that most churches define works of service as just like their Sunday service. So when you grew up, probably it's either the Sunday service or like sanctioned activities by the church
Yeah.
Right.
itself.
Yeah.
So
Passing around the collection plate or
right.
Yeah.
Passing around the collection plate, maybe singing up on stage or playing an instrument, or watching kids in the nursery or something like that, And that's the traditional way I always heard this passage preached. It was like, it's our job to equip you for ministry. So there's a sign-up table in the back. Go on and sign up for some volunteer activity that you can do within the church.
Right.
And there was a professor I had here at Mid-South that really got me to think about this differently, because he pointed out, he gave kind of a hypothetical scenario. He said, imagine that there is a ER nurse that is a member at your church, and she works the night shift all week long, but she still has her Sundays off so that she can come to church. So she's been working night shift all day long. She probably worked all the way through the night, went home, showered, got dressed, and showed up for church. She's exhausted. She's been working really, really hard, and she is there for a church service, and instead she gets to sit there and just hear the preacher guilt trip her for 30 minutes or whatever about not serving enough. And his point was, she is serving. Her actual job as a nurse is literally serving the needy, the sick, the people who have needs. Jesus is described as the great physician. What more ministerial servant work could there be than working as a nurse and working in a hospital? And so his challenge to us as people who are training to be ministers ourselves was, how can you help her understand that the work she is doing as a nurse is ministry? And how can you help her bring that more into how can you help her change her mindset about her work? So it's not just like, I'm doing work and then I go do more work at the church or something like that. But how can the work that I'm doing in my day-to-day life, how can I do that in a God-honoring way, in a way that is like ministering to people who are in need? And, that's just one example. But in general, I think that the main reason people, I want to give a little bit of credit. The main reason people sometimes kind of ruffle their feathers whenever the preacher's up there trying to tell them, you don't serve enough, you need to come serve in the church, is because legitimately they work really hard. They spend a lot of their days doing a lot of work, and they're like, I don't want to come and have someone here guilt trip me for more work that I have to do.
Right.
So the challenge he gave us was something I've really taken into heart, was how can we, as church leaders, help people see the work and the vocations that they already have as ministry, and how can we better equip them to do that ministry? So he said, for that nurse, one of the best things you could do as a preacher and a minister in that church is, maybe help her to understand that the work she is doing to help other people is ministry. Help her grow in her own ability to share her own faith. You never know. She's going to develop relationships with patients. She might have an opportunity to share the gospel with somebody. Right. Help her maybe have scripture and ways of thinking through things to help her process through trauma and grief. She's probably going to see a lot of trauma in the church. One of the best things you can do as a minister is help counsel her through that, help walk her through that, help equip her for those works of service. And that was one interesting way that he had brought it up. And that's been, I think, a good way to think about it. I do think that those works of service that church leaders are equipping people for are not necessarily just volunteering during the Sunday service or during like a soup kitchen thing or something like that the church is putting on. So I think that that's a nuance. Do y'all have any thoughts related to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fundamental shift in what we consider to be ministry, what we consider to be, kingdom work. I think it needs to be noted that, and this is one of the things that I try to tell my congregation, is that they're already in a position to do works of service, right? That it's not like they have to kind of do something different than they're already doing, as far as like, finding a ministry, that they're already positioned to do ministry where they're at, whatever their job is, whatever their, circle of influence is, that they already have that capability to do that serving. And one of
Right.
the passages that I kind of go back to um, is found in, let me see if I can find it now. I just had it.
Well, yeah, because what you were saying, it's not like we need them to go to seminary and they need to become Bible scholars and experts, and we need them to. It's not like we're necessarily calling them to become church people, church leaders, church ministers. But
Right.
they have the where they're at now, doing what they're doing now.
Right.
They have the ability to minister.
Yeah,
It's
and
not.
the passage I usually go to is actually also in Ephesians 2, verse 10, for we are his workmanship created in
Yeah.
Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them. Kind of suggesting that, we're kind of already in a unique position. God has made us, given us a certain set of talents, a certain personality, and we're going to be influential in a certain circle of people that we are going to be uniquely qualified to help.
Yeah,
And if we
and I
don't
love
do
that
it,
verse too, because
who else is?
it brings up the fact that God already has a plan. He's already figured out what those things are He wants us to do. He's
Right.
got them worked out. He's prepared in advance the good works He wants us to do. So, He's got a plan. He's got it figured out, and He's going to help us make those things happen. So,
right. So as church
that is a
leaders,
really good-
we're there to help. I think, like you said, help them understand that their lives can be that ministry. They're whatever they're doing already. That they can incorporate and it's being a Christian should be an all-inclusive thing. It shouldn't be just something isolated to Sunday mornings or Wednesday night Bible studies.
Absolutely. And so I always like to bring up that nuance when we're talking about this, just because I do want to avoid that guilt trippy church leader thing that a lot of people do, where they're just like all these exhausted people who work really, really hard in their day-to-day jobs show up at church and feel that they're being told there's one more thing that they have to do.
Right.
It's not really one more thing. It's more about understanding how everything you're doing is these works of service in this ministry. And I do think that there is a legitimate reason people feel upset, because I don't know about that church, the church you growing up, Noah, but my suspicion is that was usually what they meant when they said you're supposed to serve the church, was on a Sunday morning or on a church sanctioned event.
Right. We got a list of stuff we need done.
Yeah. I don't think I ever heard a sermon in which what you're doing in your day life, vocation-wise, could be counted as that.
Right.
And I mean, part of me wants to push back on that a little bit too, because I feel like that also could be used as an excuse for just not serving at all in any kind of capacity. It's like, and I get it. In some senses, it's like you could have someone that's doing their 40-hour-a-week job or whatever, and they're like, I count that as my service, and it's not done with the right heart or mental attitude, I guess. And so I could see a pushback from some people that from that church, just saying that hey, we're trying to push people more towards serving in a more Christ-like way.
Right.
But I don't know. I think that there's a danger in. This is why I want to have this discussion, because I can see it from both sides throughout my entire life. I think there's a danger in becoming so service-minded that you then begin to become almost achievement driven. It's almost like all of service and all of the things you're doing is really just to impress other people around you, or because you're checking off the boxes of what's expected and you're not really invested in your heart towards those things. And that's what I would see a lot in growing up, was that you had a lot of kids that were doing these things not necessarily because they wanted to do them, but because the organization of the church overall decided this was what we were going to go do. And so they were just kind of along for the ride, you know? And as time went forward and they grew up, very few of them continued to do that kind of ministry after they graduated and moved out, because, you know, for the most part, it was something that was only instituted by the church, and once they had the freedom to decide how they're going to live their own lives, didn't really, you know, amount to much. And so I was seeing what the church was intending to do not work, you know, in the one hand, and then two, a lot of times I'd see even like a reticence to even want to go near that after, because they had done so much of it in their younger years. And especially for me, I had to like really wrestle with that, as like how much of that was just like people made me do things I didn't want to do, and how much of that was like wanting to develop like how much of that was just like sin. I kind of, at some point I had to like really like, you know, realize that there was a little bit of both in that, you know, a little bit of it was just, you know, young rebellious kid, but another part of it was legitimately just not wanting to serve. And I think having a perspective where I came into modern church life and realizing that they don't need me at all, you know, they don't want service at all even. It was really jarring in that way, because now it felt like the pendulum had been switched like entirely the opposite direction, and now it felt like churches were like basically could exist and run their services without me showing up even at all, and then I didn't feel needed at all. And so it was a weird shift of realizing that, you know, the things that they demanded and things like that did make me feel like I was part of the community, you know? Like the things they asked for service-wise made me feel like I was like a part of their service and a part of what I, you know, made me feel even validated sometimes. And so modern churches not doing that as much made me feel like I wasn't needed, wasn't validated, wasn't, you know, was just another person in the pew. And so it's always created this like sort of push and pull in my mental heart about it, of like how should the church best approach this, you know? Because I won't deny that the churches in modern times do it way more efficiently, because it's generally people are paid for those positions and they do it better because they're paid, you know, than like a 12-year-old kid that's running sound that doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
You know, so in one sense, it's like, you know, you put on a better show. It's more efficient, you know. But in one sense, you're also losing involvement, and so it's a weird one. That this is why the topic's so nebulous to me, is that there's so many facets to it. You know, there's the facet of like, what's the duty of someone going to the church, like what we're talking about. But then there's also the facet of what's the benefit for the congregation if they do serve, you know? So yeah, I don't know where you want to jump from there, but that was just the random thought I had going.
I mean, I guess like with everything you're saying, my mind kind of goes to maybe we need to kind of reevaluate how we even view the church. You know, like what is the church? Are we just looking for worker drones to, you know, like you said, check off boxes? Or is it, you know, the other side of that you're describing is almost like it's just a spectator sport, you know, like you're just having people, you know, sitting in the bleachers, not active at all, not participating at all. And I think there's um a more biblical kind of like middle ground, which is to me the idea of family. You know, like if you are part of a family, then there are times when you need your needs met. You know, you need others to kind of be there for you and comfort you, but then you're also a part of it. So you have a role to play too, and you need to kind of pull your weight as far as, you know, making sure the family is healthy, you know?
The hard part with that is like deciding when and where one happens and the other begins. You know, like deciding when to stop working and receiving, and then deciding when to start giving and serving, you know?
Right.
Because I think in a family dynamic, that happens a lot of the time based off of your emotional, like, mood, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can remember many times, like, if like I've had like a bad day or something like that, and I'm supposed to like clean the house, my mom would be like, "Hey, like, don't worry about cleaning the house because you're obviously like super tired. We'll take care of that tomorrow," or something like that, right? In churches, I don't know. It feels as if the problem is that those things still need to get done. You know, if you didn't clean the church that day, it's not going to get cleaned. You know, and so it's like there's a bit more structure that demands things still needing to get done on time. That almost takes the family notch down a bit, I guess. It makes it harder to do that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think I agree with you, Tom. I love that. That's been my own paradigm shift that I've been trying to make a lot too. The people here at the church are probably tired of hearing me share the same anecdote, but it's just, it was impactful to me to realize that before Christianity, you didn't have any religious movement that referred to each other as brother or sister. Right. That's something that is original to Christianity. Since then, a million other cults and religions, and everybody uses it now. But there's a really good book by Larry Hurtado called Destroyer of the Gods, where he makes that point that prior to Christianity, we don't have any archaeological evidence of groups of religious movements considering each other in familial units before the church, even like amongst the Jews, you know, in synagogues and stuff like that before that. So I think you're right. For the early church especially, the primary dynamic for them was that they were a family. You know, I think of even the words of Jesus when he has his mother and his brothers come and try to see him, and people tell Jesus, they're like, "Hey, your mother and brothers are outside," and he kind of points to the people gathered and he says, this is my family now. And it is interesting how for the church it has been essential to redefine things around family. And so I like that. I wouldn't have even thought to go that way, but you're so right. That is the paradigm shift that really helps to bring a lot of these things into focus. Because you are right, a family is one where your moods can change and where the roles can shift based on what's going on in your life at different points in time and different things like that.
And generally they're better capable of reading your mood, where I don't know if I would say that many of the church members growing up were capable of reading my mood enough to know, oh, he's like having a bad day, let's not give him work today.
And that's why we're not necessarily talking about what churches are, but we are talking about probably what we want them to should be, you know?
Right.
And so I think the same goes for, I think those same family dynamics can still exist in the church and should still exist in the church because that's what it is. So I think even the attitude you echoed that some people will be like, some things just have to get done, is a misunderstanding of what the church is. And if the paradigm shifts, then we will have the freedom to be able to operate that way a little bit more. Another historical point that's interesting is that you talked about how modern churches are a little different than the church you grew up in. I think part of that has to do with a lot of what people call the church growth movement and the megachurch movement or the seeker-sensitive movement, which was a whole movement of churches that started specifically with the explicit purpose of growing numbers numerically, as many people, bringing as many people into the church, doing everything as efficiently as possible, sharing the gospel with as many people as possible, getting as many people to make professions of faith as possible. And they brought in a lot from the business world, a lot from marketing and efficiency, and a lot of those different things like that. And you saw once that movement started to take on in the church is when you shifted to more of a paid for everything. So my dad talks about this all the time. The idea of having all your musicians on the stage being paid was like unheard of in his life growing up. Like he never would have been in a church where literally every musician on stage is paid. But the church growth movement, which was so focused on excellence and doing everything the best possible way, that was the best way that they could guarantee that everyone on stage was going to be incredible, is just pay everybody so they'll do really, really great. Pay the preacher so he's going to be the best preacher possible. All of that was for a specific purpose, but that specific purpose is more narrow than what I would say the specific purpose of the church as a whole is. The specific purpose of the church growth movement was exactly that, church growth. It was evangelizing and growing the church numerically as much as possible. And so for all of those reasons, I do think paying people, if that's your goal, that's probably the best way to make that happen, is paying people and all this kind of stuff. But I do think that the church has to be a lot more than that. And I think that's a part of it, but I think that if the church is fulfilling its job, it's going to do a lot more than just grow numerically. And I think if you're growing the people in maturity, if you're meeting other people's needs, if you're loving each other well, if you're doing all of the various things that I think a church should be doing, then you would have the freedom to be like, or Noah's not feeling it today. He doesn't have to vacuum. It doesn't matter. In the church growth movement, you can't do that. A new person might show up and they'll see that the floor's not vacuumed and they're not going to come to faith. So we've got to make sure that you vacuum the floors if that's your goal. But again, I do think we need to expand our view of what the church is. And it's not just pray the sinner's prayer factory like I think it is for a lot of church growth churches.
I think what I'm hearing both of you say is that the churches that I grew up in almost seemed like a worker bee hive, where you just kind of have everybody kind of working all the time, volunteering all the time, and you have this fear of being burnt out because of that. And then modern churches have too much of a corporate kind of way of thinking, and flip the opposite way, and that instead of a worker bee or a corporate mentality, maybe we need to have this like family dynamic where there's this give and take kind of thing. So I'm taking that as a summary, which I think is really good.
I agree. I love that you brought that up, Tom. That is a big paradigm shift that I think could really help us figure it out. Because no one in a family is going to get mad at you if you are like, I want the family to do things for me. I don't just want to do things for the family. Right. I've talked to a lot of mothers who feel like they are the ones that are always doing everything for their family and no one is ever doing anything for them. That's not a healthy family. Right. And the church should be the same way.
And then I would, if we take that a step further, like what is the goal of the family? You think of the seeker sensitive movement, like you were talking about, where, the goal is just to get as many people in there as possible. So they're coming and they're, receiving the word and worshiping and all that. But what is the kind of end effect of that? If we go back to that passage in Ephesians, the whole purpose for the equipping of the saints, it goes on to say, for the building up of the body of Christ until we attain the unity of faith, the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man. So the idea is like maturity, right? So you think in a family, Nick, you have a son and I have a son. And the whole idea is that, we are nurturing that child and eventually they're going to grow up, right? They're going to mature and then they're going to start their own family, right?
And be able to serve us too, I'm hoping.
Right.
My dad talks about that, it reciprocated a lot. And that's what you get kind of in a family. As you are maturing people, they are growing, then they can turn around and serve you. And I think that maybe, now that I'm thinking about it, is the issue, because it's usually set up as this binary. It's either got to be one or the other. We sometimes miss. We're just thinking about it wrong. I was asking the wrong question. We're thinking about the wrong paradigm.
Part of me is like the seeker-sensitive movement's kind of right in that, like, if you're a new person that walks into a church first time in there, at least this might be me, it's probably everybody else, I don't know, but the first thing I do not want to be handed is like a piece of paper that's like, you should sign up for these 10 things.
Yep.
Like if I'm a new person that's coming in that's like, just trying to feel out the church, like I just want to sit down in a pew, go home and think about how that went, So, I mean, they've got some points.
Absolutely.
Like, you don't want to be like stuffed down your throat immediately of serve.
Right. but how long are you a seeker?
Right,
Like you come in as a seeker, but at some point we got to move beyond that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, that's where I feel like seeker-sensitive churches miss, is that like they're always concerned about the new member, never the member that's been there 20 years, and that to me, I think, is like the beauty of like what you're saying about a family dynamic, is that it's you feel more loved, because like if you're in this constant interplay, people know you, and like you're developing deeper relationships with people. And so I think in that sense, the service doesn't even start to feel like service anymore, because if I'm doing something for my mom or my dad or my sister or something like that, it doesn't necessarily feel as much like work,
Right.
And the hard thing was, I think, growing up, I always would hear people make the argument that like, if you're down or if you're in a mood, if you serve, you'll feel better, because doing something good for someone else is going to naturally make you feel better. And for a while, I actually kind of believed that. Like, I kind of believed that like if you did something good, that it would like make you feel better. But I've also realized over time that if you're in a bad mood, that can also make you worse, like bring you into an even worse mood, just because you're mentally not like able to deal with some of the thoughts that might be in your head as well, because you're tired.
Well, I think it depends. I think for some, they need to serve. Maybe they haven't been doing anything and they've only been receiving, and they need to give back. But then for others, like you said, maybe they're getting burnt out. Maybe they've been doing this same job and they're starting to, feel resentful about it. That they're always the one that has to do it, or something like that, Right. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely a case by case situation, I think is what you're saying, and I think I would agree with that. It's like there is it's not always the case that if you serve someone, you're going to feel better,
Right.
And I think that's something that I had to learn growing through it, is that I think that's where the churches I grew up in kind of got it wrong, is I think they just kind of assumed that if you serve all the time, that you'll just get better. And so I think that's kind of the line I walk these days, is serving is really great. It helps you get involved. It helps you feel like you're, part of a community, a family, but it's not the answer to every problem,
Right.
And sometimes can even aggravate problems. And so on that side of the fence, that's where I've learned. But on the other side of the fence, it's like if we just get rid of service altogether and don't ask anybody in our congregation to serve, then we just have this people that don't feel like they belong to a family, don't feel like they're involved, don't feel like they're doing anything, feel worthless even because they're not being asked to do anything. And so it's kind of that two sides of the story kind of thing, where like you kind of have to like find the truths from both sides and kind of pull them together.
Yeah, there needs to be a balance, I think, for sure.
Yeah, kind of continuing the paradigm of family. I remember a impactful thing I heard. The famous preacher evangelist Francis Chan. He said something really interesting, and he gave this talk at Google, which was super interesting because it's like Francis Chan, here's this Christian church guy talking to like just a random group of Google employees. And it's just like a webcam stream that you can find on YouTube where he was talking to them. But he went through this shift himself a little bit, leaving the kind of big seeker-sensitive style church that he was a part of and switching to some different models of church. And he used the example of the difference between what an orphan feels like at an orphanage versus at adopted in a family. And so he said, if you are an orphan, if you've been orphaned, and you are at an orphanage, technically your needs are being met. They're feeding you, you have a roof over your head, somewhere to sleep, friends and relationships with people. But nobody would argue that that's fine. Obviously, the much better alternative to that would be to be adopted and be a part of a family where they know you better. You still have a roof over your head. You still have, your food getting provided for, everything like that. His belief was that the modern way that we have decided to do church tends to create more orphanages than families, where you're technically, your pastor is there and you can go get counseling if you need it. Yeah. Technically, you can go and hear preaching where they explain the word to you. Technically, you are getting communion every week where you can, be together with other Christians. Technically, all of these things are being checkmarked. But the challenge he gave was, how can we actually meet those needs, not technically, but more robustly, more completely, and more maybe organically or authentically, just more natural in a way that really fully fills all of the needs that we can have. And I think that has been a big shift in how I've been trying to think through what we want to do with the church a little bit as well, is trying to figure out how can we have people's needs met, but in a way that is more full-fledged than just like check marking a box saying that those needs were met. Same goes with service and everything along the way. So I love that we had you on for this, Tom, because I was thinking this was going to be one of those where we would just talk and like come to the end of it and be like, I don't know if we really have a solution. But Tom said like 3 sentences and just like answered it for us in a few ways. So I do think we have a little bit more of an answer than I expected us to have.
Well, I can't take too much credit. I mean, I didn't come up with the idea myself, so.
Before we finish up, I guess I just want to open it up. If you guys have any like final parting thoughts, any things you wanted to make sure we said as we think through this topic. Cool. All right. So I said at the beginning of the podcast that I would give you all a few updates on some things going on here at the church. Biggest thing recently, the biggest reason we've been so busy and didn't have a time to do these podcasts is we have moved our offices, and we're actually in the same building now where we do our church services from. So it's called the Dutka Memorial Chapel building here on the campus of Mid-South Christian College. That's the building we've been using for all our live streams. Now it's also the building for our offices and where we do all our podcasts and just like Wayfarer's headquarters. It is just all in this one building now, which has been great. I love not having to move all the camera gear back and forth between rooms and all that kind of stuff. It's been super, super cool. We did that for a few reasons, but one of the big reasons is that has opened up a lot of our opportunities as well to start having in-person services. So with Wayfarers for the last several months since we started, we've mostly been doing only online. About a month ago now, we started our first services in person, and I wanted to make sure to reemphasize that for any of those of you that have been tuning in and watching. The doors are open. You guys can come hang out with us in person. You don't just have to watch us through a screen. This is one of those ways that I think you can get a little bit much more of a family connection. I've had a lot of FaceTime calls with my family over this era of COVID, but there is no denying that there's something different about being a family face-to-face than being a family over the internet. I am thankful for the internet, but there's just a different thing that happens when you can kind of meet face-to-face and in person. So I'd encourage any of you, those of you watching, if you want to come hang out, come in person. You can. We're at 3097 Knight Road here in Memphis, again on the campus of Mid-South Christian College, in the Dutka Memorial Chapel building, which is kind of in the back corner of the campus. So we would love to see any of you. Sunday nights at 7 is when we meet here in the chapel building. There's a lot of really cool things that we've got in store now that we are open for the in-person services, but we'll be talking a little bit more about that in future episodes. In the meantime, I hope that this was helpful to those of y'all that are tuning in and listening. Hopefully it gave you something to think about as we, navigate what it looks like to be the church in kind of the modern world that we're living in today. Tom, thank you so much for joining us again. It was a lot of fun having you on again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I love how like long-winded me and Noah are, and how like clear and concise and like to the point Tom is. I wish we were more like you, but it's called a deep dive for a reason, I guess. So it was fun to have you on. I love your thoughts. You gave us a lot of really, really good things to think about, and I do think you maybe helped answer some questions for me and Noah at least. So that was super helpful. I'm super glad to have you on. Super thankful for all of those of you that tuned in live or maybe are watching this later. Again, going to reemphasize that. Come join us in person, 7 o'clock here this Sunday. I think you will really enjoy the opportunity to meet in person. But besides that, we will just see you guys next week on the following Deep Dive podcast. So, bye, everybody.
Take care.
See you.